So, I welcome all the viewers to today's KWK talk. So, to welcome you all formally, I request the Director of Jawaharlal Nehru Planetarium, Dr. B.R. Guruprasad, to take over.
Good afternoon once again to all the people who have joined this Kaapi with Curiosity KWK talk, hosted jointly by ICTS and Jawaharlal Nehru Planetarium, normally at JNP Bangalore here, but today due to certain uncertainties and unavoidable circumstances, it could not be held here. And anyway, it is going through YouTube live online. And we have a very interesting talk by two honored speakers, Professor Cailin O'Connor and Professor James Owen Weatherall, both from the University of California at Irvine. And once again, on behalf of JNP and ICTS, I thank them for their kind gesture. And now I request Professor Ajit to take over. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My name is Ajit Parameswaran. I'm at ICTS. I'm very excited to introduce the speakers of today's Kaapi with Curiosity lecture. As Dr. Guruprasad said, unfortunately, we could not have it as a live event in the planetarium. This would have been a particularly a great way to do it because this is a particularly relevant topic in our contemporary world, where misinformation is so widespread. It has entered all walks of life in a major way and is affecting our decision-making capacities as individuals, as well as society as a whole. And I'm very much looking forward to gaining some understanding of this complex problem through today's lecture. So today's speakers are Professor Cailin O'Connor and Professor James Owen Weatherall. They are philosophers of science at the University of California, Irvine. They study very interesting questions concerning our society at large and have written many impactful books. In particular, they have co-authored this book called the Misinformation Age, which considered how false beliefs propagate in our society through human social networks. So I believe today's talk will be broadly based on this book, this book, and without any further delay, let me welcome the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind welcome. Jim and I are both really happy to be here today. We're sorry that we can't be doing this in person at the planetarium, and it is a little weird that we usually live, thousands of miles away, and now we're just a couple kilometers away, but we're doing it online. But at least we all get to be here. All right, so the talk today is called Curation as Misinformation, and we will just get started with a little example, which we'll return to later in the talk. So over the last few decades, the Coca-Cola company has been extensively funding and then communicating about exercise science, and in particular, the link between exercise and good health outcomes, like the reduction of diabetes. And also, they've been really emphasizing what is sometimes called the energy balance message, which is that your weight gain and loss is about this balance between energy you take in and energy you put out. And they've been doing this in India as well as other countries. So the Coca-Cola India Foundation works both with athletes and sports foundations here to promote this message. So subsequent to this funding spree, a number of scientists and journalists have become worried about what Coca-Cola is doing here. So in 2017, the Union of Concerned Scientists published a memo raising worries about Coca-Cola's campaign. But notably, none of the critics of Coke have accused them of fraud or of promoting bad research practices or of lying. The worry just seems to be that they're funding and sharing research on exercise, even though the research itself seems to be fine, which raises a question: what's wrong with this? So why shouldn't Coca-Cola fund and share otherwise independent, good research on exercise? We'll return to that question a little later in the talk. But we bring this up as one example out of many we'll give of how curation, writ broadly, can harm public belief. And what we'll argue in the end is a number of things. So first, the distribution of information we receive, which facts, which events, which studies, deeply shapes our beliefs. For this reason, true or accurate information can be highly misleading. Even though we don't think of true information as potentially misleading, we're going to show how it can be. Now, for that reason, we tend to see industry groups, political groups, other bad actors using this fact to their benefit. And what we also see is that sometimes even well-meaning individuals curate information in ways that accidentally harm belief. And one thing that we'll argue at the end of the talk is, for these reasons, curation should matter more to information policy. So before we really dive in, I want to situate this talk a little bit. So as Ajith mentioned, Jim and I published this book 5 years ago now, The Misinformation Age. And what we do in there is try to understand the ways that social factors end up leading people to believe false things, and how false beliefs might spread in human social networks. So in developing that project, what we did is wrote a number of papers together and with different co-authors and with different researchers, thinking generally about why human beliefs can fail. And this is going to be the larger project that we're drawing from in this talk. Now, generally, we use a particular kind of strategy for this work, which mostly looks at historical case studies and mathematical models to better understand factors that tend to lead to false beliefs. And what I mean by mathematical models is that we use computer simulations to create representations of groups of real human learners, and then to investigate how they might develop beliefs or how beliefs might spread and propagate. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this modeling work, but we're happy to say more in Q&A. So here's an overview for the rest of the talk. First, what I'm going to do is give a little bit of background about what we're even talking about here. What counts as curation? What counts as misinformation? And then what we'll do is walk through 3 subtopics. So one that looks at curation in science journalism, one that considers how people in industry can cherry pick scientific data, curate it to mislead, and then another that's about what we call industrial distraction, before drawing some bigger picture takeaways. And as you see, you'll see Jim isn't going to stay silent the whole time. He'll get a turn to talk as we go through.
In fact, right now.
Not quite yet, but very shortly. All right, so let's start with misinformation. What are we talking about when we talk about misinformation? Well, sometimes what people will pull out is this distinction between misinformation and disinformation, where misinformation is supposed to be content that is inaccurate or misleading, but accidentally so. So maybe something people are sharing online that's misleading, but they don't even know that it is. And disinformation is supposed to be purposefully misleading content. But these distinctions can get muddy, especially when we're talking about online information, because often what we see is something is created as disinformation, but then as people share it, the people sharing it are people who believe it. So it turns into misinformation. And often things are designed to purposefully do that. Now, in addition, philosophers and other researchers often define both things as involving false or inaccurate content. But again, when you start looking at how misleading content works, this isn't always the best definition. So for example, the form and content of misinformation is widely variable and ever-changing. So some of this content is just things like a video or a picture or a meme. Sometimes it's just an emotional statement with no false claims. Sometimes it's a coloring book of a political figure, which if you want, you can ask about in Q&A. That's a real example. So it's often not even the sort of thing that can be false or true. And it's increasingly recognized that accurate content can mislead, and in fact, that it's used to mislead all the time. So the picture we're going to be working with and developing here is going to be a broad one, where we think that a lot of things ought to count as misinformation. We'll say a little more about that in the end. Now, what about curation? What are we talking about here? Again, we're thinking about something general, and these are going to be whatever processes determine what information out of all the information out there tends to reach people. So when you think about curation, you might imagine a smart person with a master's degree who's picking out all the best journalistic pieces for the last year and putting them into some place to look at. But if we look at a wider picture of curation, what we're going to be talking about are people like textbook writers, journalists, influencers, propagandists from industry and politics, librarians, social media algorithms, science journals, Google search algorithms. All of these types of things are going to be influencing what distribution of information comes to everyday people. And notice here that curation on this picture is not generically or typically a bad thing. Some kind of curation is completely crucial to our functioning because we can't take in or focus on all the information out there. We need to know what out of all of science is relevant or interesting. And we need to know what current events are going on that actually matter to us. And when we do something like search online for a new laundry machine, we want Google to curate the best hits for us to see, not a bunch of junk. So we need curation, but what we're going to do as we move through these parts of the talk is discuss how it can go wrong. And with that, I will turn it over to Jim to talk about journalistic selection.
Okay, so let's talk about journalistic selection. We're going to begin with a handful of examples. So first, here's an example from India Today. This is the pandemic era example. The headline says 4 of a family die of COVID-19 in 12 days in Ghaziabad, leaving behind 2 girls aged 6 and 8. Okay, so this is of course a very sad story. We have every reason to think it's a true story. But it's also the case that this sort of event was relatively rare during the pandemic. It's certainly true that many people died. There weren't so many cases of families where 4 people died. It did happen. It made national news when it did happen. The point is that it's not representative. Here's another example. Bengaluru weather update. The city braces for cold wave as temperatures dip to 10 to 12 degrees centigrade. So this is a story from this January. Of course, we see weather news all the time. But of course, you don't see news about the weather on the front page of the newspaper every day. You tend to see it when it's unusual, when the temperatures are out of the range of what you usually expect, or when you're going to have particularly extreme weather events. Okay. Here's another particularly important example, this one more specifically from science journalism. So this is from the very beginning of the pandemic. The headline is "New data suggests the coronavirus isn't as deadly as we thought." Right. So this is a story authored by one of the authors of a study that came out of Stanford in April of 2020, shortly after the pandemic exploded. What the study found was an anomalously low infection fatality rate for COVID. Anomalously, I mean relative to what other scientists were finding at the time. This study got a lot of attention. This author wrote an opinion article in the Wall Street Journal describing the study and arguing that some of the mitigation measures that had been put into place were perhaps not justified, given that it turns out the disease is not as deadly as people thought. Now, it happens to be the case that the version of this article that was widely discussed in the news was based on a preprint, that is, a version of the article that hadn't been published. The version that ultimately was published actually involved revised numbers showing fatality rate that was much closer to what other scientists had found. So what's going on in these cases? The idea is that journalists curate information in all sorts of ways. In particular, they systematically respond to incentives and norms or ethical codes when doing so. Now, one of the biggest of these is that they face strong incentives to produce grippy and exciting content. Now, this has always been true, but in an online world, there's even greater pressure to write stories that are clickbait, that will draw readers in, and that means writing more exciting stuff. Now, journalists are also constrained by norms to report true content, meaning they usually don't just make up stories. But it's typically acceptable for them to report on only the most exciting or extreme of the real events, right? Because these tend to draw readers in, they're novel and surprising, and humans love novelty. Now, that's not necessarily bad. Of course, it's the definition of newsworthiness. But even so, what it means is that what journalists end up describing, writing about, isn't fully representative of what actually happens. Okay, and so this paper that Cailin and I wrote with a colleague, Aidan Mohseni, called The Best Paper You'll Read Today, Media Biases and the Public Understanding of Science, we decided to ask what this sort of curation would do to the beliefs of readers. So what happens to a smart, savvy learner who sees only news about extreme events? We built a model. We started by saying, suppose the world is normal. That is, we have some distribution of events, look kind of like what real events would look like. They're distributed continuously across some range of possible parameters. So maybe these events represent the severity of fire seasons over different years. Maybe they represent COVID IFR estimates, right? And so the idea is that each of these are going to be numbers that can vary, that there's going to be some actual average and some variation around that average. Okay, so different kinds of things can fit into this model. Okay. Now, we then consider what happens if journalists only report extreme graphs, extreme events. What we end up with is a distribution of reported events that looks something like this. The events that are far from the center, far from the average, end up getting reported less, whereas the extreme events get reported more. We break out this middle chunk of events when we only report on extreme events. So, for instance, you might have reporting only about mild fire seasons, reporting about severe fire seasons, with less reporting about normal middle-of-the-road fire seasons. Now, what does this end up doing? It ends up making the world seem more extreme. First, it distorts viewers' beliefs, right? It makes extreme events seem more common than they actually are. The world seems more variable, the truth more diffuse. Okay. Now, it also does another thing. This one's a little bit more subtle. We know that people tend to pay more attention to information that fits with what they already believe. This means that extreme evidence in our models can actually drive polarization. So suppose that someone is a climate change denier. They tend to think that climate change isn't real. When they're looking at this evidence, they're going to tend to look at the evidence that conforms with their pre-existing beliefs. This is something known as confirmation bias, the well-documented psychological effect. What this means is that as that person looks at the evidence that's reported in this extreme reporting scenario, their beliefs might change a little bit, but they're going to converge to look more like the left extreme, the extreme that only reports mild fire seasons. Contrast that with someone who is a climate change believer. This is someone whose beliefs may begin on the other side of this distribution. As they read the news, their beliefs might also change, but they're going to tend to focus on the more extreme events on the right side, the ones that look like more severe fire seasons. So their beliefs might also change, but they're going to end up looking like the right side of this graph. What ends up happening is that both of these people end up having different perceptions of what the world is like, because the news is selectively reporting certain things and they're selectively focusing on those things. Now, the important point is that because there's nothing in the middle, or very little reported in the middle, there isn't enough evidence that would sort of pull these people closer together. There's only extreme evidence on each side, which is much easier to focus on or conversely ignore. So here's another thing. This isn't actually in our models, but it's a way in which it's a real world worry, which is that reporting on contradicting extreme events can be extremely confusing. Here's an example. Science journalists very often report on single studies. And so what this means is they pick out articles that appear in the scientific literature that they think are interesting, and they report on them without providing any context of what the literature as a whole says. And so you end up seeing competing news articles of this character. Right, so here's one from 2022. Want a healthier heart? Seriously consider skipping the drinks. This article, based on one research article in a scientific journal, says that drinking alcohol is dangerous for your heart. Meanwhile, here's another article, also based on a single research result, that says a glass of red wine is the equivalent of an hour at the gym, says a new study. These just contradict one another. It creates a sense of whiplash and can make people give up and just frustrated, confused, and even mistrustful. Okay. So here's another context where this matters. The same kinds of effects can happen with social media algorithms. These algorithms tend to select extreme content because that content is novel and surprising, and people like that. Here's another journalistic norm. Journalists follow an ethical code, requires fairness or balance on controversial issues. What this often involves is curating or selecting information to give equal weight to two sides of an issue. This can happen even in cases where there isn't actually equal evidence on both sides of the issue. So especially in science journalism, many worry about a false balance, where one side is less scientifically supported, but gets artificially propped up by journalists' need to provide both sides of a story. Reporting on climate change is a classic case, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s. Okay, and so here's an example from a little over a decade ago. This is an article from the Guardian newspaper, the British newspaper, reporting on the reporting practices of Fox News, an American cable news station, saying Fox News defends global warming false balance by denying the 97% consensus. And what this article does is that it describes how Fox News presents both sides of this issue, even though there's, even a decade ago, there was far more weight of evidence and far more scientists who came down on one side than the other. Okay, so here's another article that Cailin and I wrote together with a different collaborator, Justin Bruner, called How to Beat Science. How to Beat Science and Influence People, Policymakers and Propaganda and Epistemic Networks. So in this paper, we build a model to consider the impacts of fairness in science, reporting specifically, by considering a network of scientists who gather evidence about some problem. The problem might be something like, is climate change happening? And they try to form an opinion about it. Now, usually their evidence points in the right direction, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the evidence that they produce is going to be misleading. And that's just because scientific evidence is always probabilistic. sometimes you get spurious results. You have to look at the overall body of evidence to figure out how to identify those cases. Okay, so now suppose that you have someone like a journalist who is looking at these scientists and then reporting on what they find. Okay, so here's a model of how that might work. You might have a number of different people, maybe they're politicians, maybe they're ordinary voters, ordinary citizens. The way they learn about the science is by listening to the news, not by reading the scientific articles themselves. The idea is that the journalist is doing the curating. The journalist is looking at the scientific results and communicating about them. Okay. So we ran simulations in which we considered how this might work. What we found was that if the journalists tries to be fair under these circumstances, tries to report evidence on both sides of an issue by searching the actual scientific community for evidence that supports each side, what's generally going to end up happening is that the people who rely on the journalist will end up having systematically inaccurate beliefs compared to the scientists themselves. Okay, so paradoxically, what we find is that fair reporting in scientific cases leads to dependably worse beliefs. This happens because journalists systematically overweight evidence for worse beliefs, because evidence generally tends to support better beliefs. A better strategy involves surveying and reporting on the entire body of evidence in a literature. So here are some takeaways from this. First, journalists, driven by incentives and norms, curate information and shape beliefs. Extreme reporting can lead to extreme beliefs, polarization and confusion. Fairness, especially in cases of false balance, can harm belief. And good practices generally involve giving context and overviewing the weight of evidence in any given case. So what we want ideally is for reports to focus less on individual pieces of evidence, more on what the body of evidence tells us as a whole. 4 people die in a family of COVID is newsworthy, but a better approach is something like COVID can be very deadly in some cases. Here's what we know about the average fatality rate. Okay, now I'm going to turn things back to Cailin.
All right, so now we'll move on to talk about industrial cherry picking and start with another historical story. So in the 1950s, it was starting to become clear that cigarettes were killing their users. So some prominent studies and widespread reporting on this led to declines in tobacco sales for the first time in decades. And in response, big tobacco panicked. So in the US, the 6 largest tobacco firms hired a public relations company to fight this consensus that their product was killing its users. And what they decided to do was something fairly new, which is that they would try to fight science using science. So in their book, Merchants of Doubt, historians of science Oreskes and Conway document and they describe what tobacco did as the tobacco strategy. So the strategy involved many different parts. One thing they did was formed a group called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which was supposedly a research group looking at, well, just is tobacco dangerous, but actually was a propaganda body. And one of the things that this group did was to put out pamphlets with headlines like 9 studies find no link between tobacco and cancer. And that would be true. There would be 9 real independent studies that had not found such a link. But what they would be failing to mention was that there were 50 other studies that had found such a link. So this is something we can call industrial cherry picking. So this strategy involves cherry picking real independent studies that happen to support industry views and sharing them widely. And in this way, industry can take advantage of the probabilistic nature of science. So we know that not every person who smokes gets lung cancer, not every person who gets lung cancer was a smoker. And so some studies will just accidentally happen to find no link between them, and then industry takes advantage of this. So to study this effect, we again built a model where we simulated scientists testing the world, but this time we assumed that policymakers or the public could see some of their evidence. And maybe some paid a lot of attention to science and maybe others less so. So we asked, what would these policymakers come to believe on the basis of the evidence that they were seeing? But importantly, we also simulated one more individual, which would be something like a tobacco propagandist, who would be curating this real scientific data. And in particular, what they would do was find studies that happen to be misleading and share all and only those studies with the policymakers. So what we found was that without a propagandist in this model, all of these observers, these policymakers, would eventually come to believe what the scientists believed. And that's because they would be seeing unbiased evidence from science, which would tend to push them towards true beliefs, like tobacco is dangerous. But when we add a propagandist in this model, the process always slows down, and in many cases, it reverses. In other words, the curation of this real independently produced data can sometimes completely mislead the public, lead them to think that tobacco is safe on the basis of independent scientific evidence. One thing that we found in this model was that this was harder for the propagandists to do when the scientists were running studies with large sample size or of high quality, because in these cases, there would be fewer findings for a propagandist to weaponize. So in this kind of regime, every study that happens to be misleading, so every study that doesn't find a link between tobacco and cancer, is one that the tobacco industry can use as a weapon to mislead public beliefs. And when there are fewer such studies, they're less able to do that. So here's a perhaps surprising takeaway here. Just because a scientific finding is real, meaning it was gathered by real scientists using ideal methods, does not mean that it isn't misinformation. So the context in which a finding is shared will determine whether it misleads or not. All right, with that, go on. Let's move on to our last topic, which is industrial distraction. So this is another propaganda strategy used by industry, but it works a little differently. So it works by reshaping the public's causal understanding of the world by sharing distracting information to industry benefit. So remember the Coca-Cola example we started with. Coca-Cola has funded and shared all this work on exercise and its benefits. And the reason scientists were getting worried about this is that it was a causal distraction. It was real, good, even useful science, but the aim of funding it was to distract from the harms of Coca-Cola and other sugary beverages on public health. So in this paper, Industrial Distraction, written with David Freeborn, we wanted to ask, how might this work? And what we did was use what are called causal Bayesian networks to model how an ideal or a rational individual might be misled by this strategy. And we considered a few variations on how it sometimes works. So we used, as I said, these causal graphs, and what these represent is how some person might think about the world and its causal structure. And each one of these little nodes here is tracking some kind of event, and then the arrows are tracking how they are related to each other, or how someone thinks they're related. So in the Coke case, people might think the world looks like this. Drinking Coke is an event that tends to cause diet-related disease. And so if you think that, maybe you think I should stop drinking Coke. But what we're seeing in this case is that Coca-Cola comes and introduces another distracting cause of dietary disease, sedentary lifestyle. So if you're someone who starts off thinking there's a strong link here, Coke does cause dietary disease, but then you see a lot of real evidence that the link between sedentary lifestyle and this disease is very strong, what you should do if you are a rational learner, an ideal learner, is to decrease your belief in this link, to start to think, well, maybe soda doesn't do that much to cause dietary disease, because maybe the main important thing is whether you're exercising or not. So hopefully this helps illuminate why this curation strategy is so worrying. They're sharing this real good scientific data, and by doing so, they can mislead even very good learners to think their product is safer than it is. Now, we also modeled a type of industrial distraction that we call distracting effects. So maybe you've heard that windmills kill birds. I'm not sure how widespread this message is in India, but certainly you see it around a lot in the US. And it's part of an influence campaign that works like this. So there's an intervention that many people are promoting, which is building windmills. And the intent here is to create a good outcome, the reduction of fossil fuel use. We should all want this. Now, people who want to keep selling fossil fuels can't convince us that windmills don't work. We know windmills will generate electricity. So what they do is instead share a distracting negative effect of this policy, which is bird death. This is something we don't want. And if they make this seem likely enough or like it's happening a lot, we might think, well, maybe the negatives here are going to outweigh the positives. So maybe we shouldn't build windmills because there's this other ultimately distracting effect that we want to avoid. And the last thing we model are what we can call distracting mitigants, which again work slightly differently. So we have some harm from industry. In this case, let's talk about the use of plastic causing plastic waste in oceans. What industry does in such cases is introduces a distracting thing that's going to mitigate that harm. In this case, recycling. So we know that recycling doesn't actually work very well to keep plastic out of the ocean, but as long as the public thinks it will work, that's enough. So how we would model this is say we have this industrial harm, the production of too much plastic, which we think will lead to ocean pollution. And so what industry does is argues that there's going to be this mitigant, recycling, that's going to block this effect, that's going to stop plastic waste from polluting the ocean. So if we thought that this causal pathway was a big worry, but we say, okay, we have something blocking this bad effect, maybe we will now think that plastic production typically won't pollute the ocean. So once again, what we're seeing is another way that industry can share some kind of information that's ultimately distracting us from a causal effect we ought to care about by making us think that causal effect is not so important. Now, industrial distraction can be even more misleading when we combine some of these distraction techniques. So let's return to smoking as an example. So we all think that smoking causes lung cancer, but industry has told us in the past that there's a distracting mitigant. And in the case of smoking, that's cigarette filters. And we see industry both developing these filters and spreading a lot of information about them, even though they don't substantially reduce risk of lung cancer. What industry has also done in this case is introduced distracting potential causes of lung cancer, like asbestos. So we might start off thinking smoking really causes cancer, but we learn, okay, there are filters, and maybe these filters are preventing that harm. And in addition, maybe there's something else, asbestos, which is causing all the lung cancer we're seeing. And this might all convince us not to worry about smoking at all. And again, what we're seeing here is just by curating which scientific data we see, industry is managing to get us to ignore a real harm. And again, they don't have to draw on fake scientific material. They can draw on real studies to do this. Now, notice that industrial distraction, so we talked about cherry picking and distraction as two different things, but this also can be a type of cherry picking, because what we're seeing is propagandists who are emphasizing just some parts of a causal truth rather than others. They're saying, look over here at the connection between exercise and dietary disease, but don't look over here at this other part of the causal truth, the connection between Coca-Cola and dietary disease. All right. So what should we take away from all this moving forward? So the biggest thesis here is that curation, the shaping of real, accurate, but incomplete information, can be just as potent a form of misinformation as lying or fraud. An important thing to recognize is that curation is often flying under the regulatory radar. So when we look at regulation of science journalism, the regulation of science funding, and the regulation of science sharing, curation is typically seen as not that worrying. So the thing we're usually trying to prevent is fraud or lying or sharing of actively inaccurate content, rather than the curation of accurate and real content. But we think that this is something that we should be rethinking. So for example, we talked in the beginning about how people have often defined misinformation or thought of it as involving false or inaccurate information. But we think considerations like the ones we've brought up here should push us towards broader understandings, because we know that accurate information can be just as misleading as inaccurate information. So we think that the right conception for misinformation should be flexible, inclusive, broad, and oriented towards action. We want to ask, what are the sorts of content, whether it's accurate content or not, that prevent people from acting in their own best interests, that prevent them from quitting smoking or prevent them from using Coca-Cola? And when we see that kind of content, we should call it misinformation, even if it draws on real science or real events. Oh, it's thundering. Now, how we understand misinformation shapes how we regulate it. And in a number of these cases, we think that having this better, broader understanding of the ways curation can impact our beliefs should point us towards policy changes, ones meant to prevent the harms of curation. We think that industry contact with science should be limited as much as possible, and industry sharing of scientific information should be much more carefully scrutinized, because right now there often are not any sorts of regulations to prevent an industry like Coke or tobacco from widely sharing just some subsets of scientific information or studies, from curating these things for a large public. We also think that in journalism, norms around talking about context and against reporting single events and studies may be important. So as mentioned, if when we share scientific information, we try to give a good overview of what a whole literature tells us, we avoid these worries about curation. And in general, scientific reporting should be trying to do that, trying to give a good sense of what all the evidence tells us is true, rather than picking out little bits of evidence that will be extreme or novel or exciting. And more generally, we think curation needs attention. Now, before wrapping up, we want to talk about social media, because some of the most important curators in the modern world are social media algorithms. And there has been discussion about how curation in these algorithms can mislead people. So if you ever heard of echo chambers or filter bubbles, the idea behind both of these concepts is that sometimes online, we end up only having information curated for us that's the stuff we want to see, that are things that confirm what we already believe. But often when we look at regulation, policy proposals to regulate misinformation online, we see a big focus on suppressing or limiting disinformation, especially false or inaccurate content. And goodness knows we want to limit the spread of disinformation, but we think that conversations about these algorithms should also focus just as much on how they shape real data, real events, and the real information reaching users. So with that, we will wrap up and say thank you.
Thank you very much, Cailin and Jim, for this very exciting, very interesting perspective on this very strange and complex social phenomena. And thank you for shedding some light on this. We have questions, so let me ask Disha to take over the curation of questions.
Hi everyone. So I hope I'm audible and my audio is all right. So Cailin and James, I'll be posting the questions in the chat for you. I'll collect them from other social media and I'll post them there. I have the first question. The first question is, would it be safe to say misinformation, disinformation tend to divide people into two groups, in a way using science and pseudoscience divides rather than unify people?
It depends on the situation. One thing we know is that in some cases, people actively use disinformation to try to divide people. Sometimes that's about a divide between science and pseudoscience, but sometimes it's other forms of disinformation. So, for example, the Russian government has targeted many countries with content where the main goal is just to promote polarization, to make people dislike each other more, mistrust each other more, and believe different things to a greater degree.
Could I also ask one question while Disha is curating other ones? I also often wonder if it was possible to give some sort of a handbook to the
Uh-oh.
Okay, so I think we lost Ajit because of internet. There's like it's raining hailstones in Bangalore right now, and
Oh, really?
in our area. So okay, so the next question I have is, can casual reasoning be used to detect and mitigate bias in AI LLMs?
So I think that this is
So,
a
so the
really
question is asking for an antidote to the problem that we are facing. Like, can casual reasoning be used as an antidote? Is the question. I'm not audible, is it? I've also pasted the question in the chat.
Yeah, we can see it. Thanks.
Okay, that's the question. Yeah.
So I think that this is a really important question, right? So I'm reading the version in the chat, which is, could causal reasoning be used to detect and mitigate bias in AI large language models? And I think one of the things that we see in large language models is a tendency to hallucinate, to generate incorrect information. This is a form of misinformation, the sort of thing that generally isn't intended to mislead, but only because LLMs don't have intentions at all. It's rather just a byproduct of how they work. But because of the way that people often interact with LLMs, it can be very difficult to tell the difference between what's accurate, what's inaccurate, what's reliable and not. One of the ways in which you might try to get rid of hallucinations, or at least mitigate the hallucination problem, is by developing systems that triangulate between different kinds of information. So LLMs are based very much on text, but you can also have systems that interact with the world in more sophisticated ways that involve causal models of how the world works, that perhaps involve things like computer vision, other sources of information about the world that basically can work the way that humans work to cross-check the things that we believe against other information. In fact, I think that way of thinking is quite helpful, even as individuals trying to assess what's reliable and what's not reliable. One piece of information is never enough, right? What you really want is to find multiple independent kinds of information about some topic that you're interested in. Don't read one story, look and see what other people are saying, look for other ways in which that story does or doesn't fit into your broader understanding of how the world works, scrutinize it, subject it to tests. And so I think that causal modeling is a way in which LLMs might be able to, next generation LLMs or AI systems might be able to reduce the rate of hallucination. Okay, here's another
The
question.
next question is about the role of curators. Like, can curators themselves, reinforce existing bias, sometimes unintentionally?
Yeah, so how can curators ensure they're not unintentionally reinforcing biases while filtering misinformation, especially when authoritative sources themselves may have conflicting narratives? So as a curator, ideally what you're doing is looking at all the evidence out there, getting your best sense of what's true in the world, given all the evidence that we have, and then trying to curate information in a way that's going to produce a good understanding in your audience. So whether that's by giving a sort of representative distribution of data or sort of describing what is the data that we actually have out here. Of course, this can be extremely difficult. We say that as if like, oh, just do that. But it's not always easy to know what evidence is out there, of the evidence that's there, what is high quality, which of it is coming from good sources, which of it may have been produced or amplified by a bad actor, like an industry representative or whatever. And sometimes, as this points out, you can have multiple authoritative sources that have conflicting narratives. So it's not easy to figure this out. And there aren't great answers about how to do it. But what you have to do case to case is try to figure out, all right, what evidence do I think is well sourced? How does this shape an accurate picture of the world? And how can I share that most accurate picture?
I want to jump in and say, I mean, one of the reasons that we talk about journalism the way that we do is that we want to say that even well-intentioned curators working within boundaries, guardrails that have been set up over generations in order to try, in most cases, to increase the reliability and trustworthiness of reporting, can nonetheless inadvertently become producers of misinformation. And so this is just to underline how hard a problem it is. I don't think that there's a way that curators can ensure that they're not unintentionally reinforcing biases while trying to filter misinformation or while trying to counter misinformation. All we can do is the best that we can do. The important thing, though, is to be aware of the role that curation is playing and all these different ways in which we're encountering curators, on social media and in the news, even in science textbooks, and be reflective on that fact as we're trying to piece together a more accurate understanding of what the evidence shows in some domain.
We can read the next question if it's useful.
So the next question is, if there was a handbook for the public to identify misinformation or disinformation in the social networks, what would it contain?
There are good ways to identify things that are more likely to be misinformation or disinformation. So for example, a lot of things you can actually go out and fact check. You can look at good sources like mainstream media sources or scientific sources to see whether claims are false or true. You can also sometimes check the source itself of potential misinformation. You could look if something's a news piece, where is it published? Is it published on a site that's sort of sketchy, or is it published on somewhere where we think we have reputable journalists working? So there are things like this you can do. Part of the reason we want to discuss curation here is that when we're looking at curated pieces of accurate content, it's often very hard to identify them as misinformation or disinformation because they are accurate. They're real content. They look like other good pieces of real content. It's extremely difficult to know, is the distribution of real content I'm getting an accurate distribution? because you would have to know what things are missing, and you don't see the things that are missing. So this is part of why we're trying to direct the conversation over here, is to say there aren't always simple answers for how you fix the problem of curation.
One thing that you can do, though, is recognize that often what you're seeing has been curated, and try to understand who has curated it and why, right? So if it's curated by a journalist writing for a reputable news site or magazine, you might think, well, this person might have incentives to exaggerate a bit or to cherry pick a bit. Their goals are going to be to attract my interest and keep me engaged. They may not have, they're less likely to have another kind of bias or another kind of vested interest. They might, but that's not sort of characteristic of that sort of source. On the other hand, if you find something that's curated and you look at who's doing the curation, and you see that, well, actually, maybe they have a conflict of interest, a funding interest, or maybe they have a political alignment, or maybe I can compare with how they're curating on this thing with how they're curating on other topics that perhaps I know more about. You can make a judgment about how reliable the curation is likely to be. And at that point, you want to start looking for other sources that might have different biases or fewer biases to get a sense of what the overall shape of the topic is.
Sorry, I'm smiling because the storm has reached us here now, and it's either little hail or really big rain.
This is the first rain of this year, so you might get hailstones. Okay, so one more question. Probably there'll be more, but yeah, next question. How does the role of curation in preventing misinformation change between topics with little information and those with plenty of alternative sources? Like, on top of my mind, I have an example. Let's say if there is a region with in which there's a conflict going on, and if you kill all the journalists that are reporting from that area, then you have very less information coming from that area. We have this going on in our own country and many places across the world. So what role does like curation have in preventing misinformation in this situation?
Yeah, so I think, what you're talking about here are situations where it's going to be very hard to get a picture of what's really going on, even if you had all the information, because it's quite limited. There just isn't a lot of information out there. In such situations, like, often curation is playing less of an important role because sort of everything people can find out is news or is being spread or is being learned about. If we were looking at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was also the case that every bit of scientific information was being shared very widely on social media because there was so little of it and people were so hungry for it. So in those cases, sometimes curation is probably playing less of a role in misinformation, but you have a new problem, which is that every little bit of data that is itself misleading is being spread very widely and very quickly.
So I guess I'm interpreting the question in a different way. So I'm interpreting the question as about how we should think about cases where there aren't multiple sources of information. There's not lots of information being shared. There's only maybe one stream of information or two streams of information, right? This often happens, for instance, during wars, where the armies that are at war with one another are reporting their statistics about fatalities, about losses of equipment, about who's moving where. There's a kind of general fog of war. It's very, very difficult to get independent information about what's happening under those circumstances. This can also happen during disasters, where it's only the authorities on the ground who have information to share. And of course, they may have an interest in what you learn and how you think about it. Now, I think we can see many cases in history where we don't really think we got an accurate picture of what was going on until years, in some cases, decades later. I think under those circumstances, it's just extremely difficult to have a full confidence that you have reliable information, because things are being curated for you by people who are deeply invested in public opinion about the subject. And I think under those circumstances, the only reasonable thing to do is adopt a position of humility, that the fact is the information we're getting may be reliable, it may not be, it may be partial, it may not be. And we need to incorporate that kind of uncertainty in decision-making around the subject. There was a question up here that I think got skipped, but I think is very important, which was, we have a lot of research grants coming from industry. Has this book or your research affected the kind of grants you can get? Or has it put you or your university in trouble? So I think that there are two separate issues here, right? So one is there are lots of research grants that come from industry. I know that that's certainly true in the US. I know that that's true in India as well, both in the US and in India. I think less in Europe, but probably elsewhere in the world as well. There's this idea from the government that public funding should be part of funding science, but that there should be a real goal to promote private funding, that ultimately science should be supported by a combination of philanthropy, industry sources, and others who have a vested interest in successful science. Now, in some cases, that seems like a good idea, right? So, if your goal is to build a quantum computer, or your goal is other kinds of technological development, you might think whether or not the science is true is up to the world. Industry can't make something a quantum computer if it's not a quantum computer, but they may have a vested interest in the success of the work. They may end up having intellectual property rights and so on that would make it such that they would want to support that research. The problem is that a lot of the scientific research we do doesn't have exactly that character, right? And so it's research on pharmaceuticals. It's research on the health effects of various products. It's research on things that are much fuzzier, where there can be a lot of uncertainty about what the facts are. It can be very, very difficult to tell whether or not something really is having long-term health effects. It requires subtle statistical methods, large studies, and so on to sort that sort of thing out, which is it requires a lot of resources to do something like build a quantum computer. But at the end of the day, when you have it, it's much easier to tell whether or not you've succeeded than in the human science case. And conversely, in the meantime, there are much stronger financial incentives involved in trying to convince people about the thing that's good for you, despite existence of uncertainty or despite maybe evidence that what you would like people to believe isn't true. And so we tend to be very negative about the role of industry funding. We think that very often it's more likely to be distributed with the intention of shaping research outcomes rather than getting to the truth, research outcomes or public perception about research outcomes. And so in a context where, for whatever reason, industry funding is needed, we advocate for things like pooling industry funds, or letting, advising industry to contribute to a fund that's then administered by an independent group based on independent scientific assessments of the best scientific research. Now, the second part of the question is about whether or not the book or our research has affected the grants that we can get, or has put us or our university in trouble. No, fortunately, and so far it hasn't.
Though, I don't think Coca-Cola or like the vaping industry is rushing to fund our research, but not in trouble anyway.
I don't think that they were interested in funding our research before we wrote the book either, so I don't think it has affected it.
Yeah. I had wanted to add a little something on the first part of that. I think this question really gets at this fundamental tension, which is that industry has a lot of money And for science to move forward, we need money. And so there's all sorts of reasons that scientists and the government and universities and everyone wants that industry money to come to science. But there's just a lot of conflicts of interest between industries, desires, and public health. And so if we take that money, we take along with it the biasing influence on our science.
Thanks a lot. That was a very elaborate and really nice answer. Also, I got some pointers for when I make these arguments elsewhere. Okay, so one more question. How often do governments censor accurate information for political reasons? And what methods do they use to hide inconvenient truths?
Yeah, this is
Please feel free to refrain from answering if you feel that you want to refrain from answering.
No, that's all right. I mean, this is very good. One thing we discuss a lot in the book and in some other things are the ways that the same kinds of things that we talked about today in the scientific context often happen in the political context as well. So we see political actors using cherry picking of accurate information, the sharing of distracting information in the exact same way that we see industry actors doing it. So in another version of this talk, we talk about how in the US, people share a lot of distracting information meant to promote the idea that voter fraud is happening, even though widespread voter fraud, there is no evidence that it is happening, for example. So the answer is often the methods used are basically identical to some of the ones we've discussed.
Governments do have access to another source of another kind of strategy, which is simply not to collect data at all. I think very often what we see is that governments that wish to hide inconvenient truths or mislead the public on something will stop collecting, stop sharing, or delete from easily accessible records information that they previously did collect and share. And so if the data is not collected, then there's nothing to analyze, there's nothing for us to see. And very often governments are the only ones who are in a position to collect certain kinds of data. They're the only ones that have the infrastructure to do so, the breadth of access, the mandate to collect the information in the first place.
It looks like
Thank you. Yeah. So one last question is whether you want to tell us more about mathematicians or for that sake, scientists' role in misinformation.
yeah, so
Great.
the
Yeah.
question is focusing on I think the role of like mainstream academics in cigarette misinformation and the tobacco strategy, which one thing that this historical work on this strategy has shown is that industry often what we call weaponizes reputation of real scientists to try to confound public belief. So often if they're trying to muddy the picture of what's happening in science to hide the fact that global warming is happening or that cigarettes are dangerous or to get people to think that exercise is really the main thing that causes or doesn't cause diabetes, they get real scientists to be the ones delivering their messages because people trust real scientists. People care about reputation in determining, like, when I hear something, am I going to trust it? Am I going to believe it? Is it going to change what I think? So if we look at the Coke and exercise example, this is a little bit of a less well-known example than some of what happened with tobacco. You see Coca-Cola funding a lot of like institutes at universities, an institute for exercise science, or funding a group of people who are looking at energy balance. And they get real scientists with real expertise to be part of those, to head them, and to really promote this energy balance message. And a lot of what they're doing is not corrupting those people, but finding the people who are going to already be willing to deliver those messages. This is something that colleagues of ours, Bennett Holman and Justin Bruner, have called industrial selection. So they're selecting which academics to fund and to put at the heads of these groups.
one of the best examples of this is that the person who was appointed by the tobacco industry at the very, very beginning of their efforts to combat sort of the growing body of evidence that tobacco was harmful to health was a geneticist. The person they put in charge of their funding body, right? They dedicated a substantial amount of money to research on the health effects of tobacco. The person who was in charge of giving out those grants was a geneticist named C.C. Little, who an extremely distinguished scientist, but who had spent his career trying to establish the genetic causes of cancer. And he was convinced that environmental factors didn't matter, only genetic factors mattered. He had a body of evidence to support that. It was his principal work himself. But of course, that reflects a particular perspective, and they chose him because of the kinds of things that he'd be more inclined to study.
Right, but he's a real expert in some area, and so people will trust him.
Thanks a lot. I think that that's all the questions for this talk. And thank you once again for being part of Kaapi with Curiosity.
Thanks for
Thanks
having
for
us.
organizing it.
Thank you very much, Cailin and Jim. It's wonderful. Sorry, we had a thunderstorm and I lost my internet for some time.
Yeah, no worries. We've been through like sun, rain, hail, thunder over here too. It's like wild weather.
Yep, and maybe we've lost you again.
Right, yes. It's like, anyway, I'll see you next week.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much. Bye.